I said when I introduced Kim Strassel that it wasn't a good idea to follow her. I was really talking about her speaking ability and her knowledge of Washington and all the little tidbits. I don't even like to read the news, so I don't have any, I'm not very up to date on things. But then, not only that, she goes into this accounting discussion of public lands. That's my speech, not hers. And before I get started, where's Kyle? Kim said that I said I spent 2 days gathering data. Wrong. I haven't spent 2 days gathering data most of my life, and certainly not since grad school. But Kyle Freusland is a research person for me, and he gathered the data, and he can attest to how hard it is to find the kind of data Kim was talking about. So I want to basically talk about, just give you the map of what Kim talked about, how much public land there is, and if you live in California, you probably have some idea. If you live in Montana or Nevada, you really know how much there is. If you get farther east, you may encounter some, but it's far less obvious. And she talked a little bit about which agencies. I'll go through these quickly. Mostly, Kyle and I have been focusing on 3 agencies: the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Forest Service, and the National Park Service, and asking the question, not so much what is the balance sheet, but we started by looking at the profit and loss statement. And Kim mentioned the 2023 data, which I spent Kyle spent 2 days looking at. Many more than that, and what's shocking, I already knew that, that's why I put him to work doing it for me. It's just almost impossible to get these data. I mean, you have to dig and dig and dig and dig, and finally you can get them, but it's really hard. So my first policy recommendation is tell these agencies every year they have to produce a profit and loss statement, period. And it doesn't have to be any better than this one, although Kyle has gathered many more details to the profit side and the revenue side and the cost side. But it's hard to know what's going on. It's not hard to understand why the people who run the agencies might not want to produce such a P&L statement, but it should be something that is quite easy, and Congress, you might think, would be a bit interested in what that looks like. So you have, and she was talking about these numbers. When Kyle first sent me the Excel sheet with these on them, I was trying to, I probably didn't have my glasses on, so I was trying to count how many digits there were. Is this hundreds? No, it's not 100,000. Is it oh, it's several million. Oh, wait, that's more than millions. We're getting to, big numbers, as Kim pointed out. And then Kyle and I talked quite a bit about just what might you do about it. And the piece that Kim mentioned that I had in the Wall Street Journal said we've got 2 people who might care a little bit about something like a P&L statement. Maybe the president and maybe the person in charge of DOGE. And if they did and they looked at a P&L statement like this, what might they say? Well, we should either raise the revenues, reduce the costs, or reduce the costs, or get rid of the asset. And that was the point of the Wall Street Journal piece. I don't think we're going to get rid of the asset by any means, but Kyle and I looked a little, or again, mostly Kyle, looked at some ways we might adjust the revenue side to see if we could break even. And there are some obvious ways. If you take the National Park Service, Kim talked about that. I just love to go with my old fart pass because I didn't have to pay anything to get my Golden Eagle pass that gets me into every place for that much. So you could raise a lot of money. Monica and I went to Kenya and visited the Masai Mara, and I have a nice picture of the gate and the entrance fees there. It was very clear we were going to pay more than any of the local residents were. So there are ways to increase revenues, and here just a couple of examples up there, but I want to get through these and talk a little bit about a couple of ways to think about policy. The first two, one is privatize them, and that's like, oh my God, you want to sell Yellowstone. Actually, I would sell Yellowstone if I were Trump, but he's not going to, nor is any other politician who wants to be reelected. Privatizing public lands is really, really difficult and isn't likely to happen on any kind of scale. When Ronald Reagan was president, my good friend and colleague went to the Office of Policy Analysis, and at that time, he and I and others at Montana State University, where we were, had looked into privatizing lands and money that we might get if we did, and so on. And even in the Reagan administration, even with James Watt, if you're old enough to remember that name, who was really the evil guy who would sell Yellowstone, nobody was serious about it, and it's dead on arrival. It's just not going to happen. But there are some trades that could occur, and I want to just touch on two quick ones and before turning it over to the other panelists. So one possibility is to trade some lands. This is a checkerboard piece of land in Wyoming. And at those intersections are private lands and federal lands. And the question is, if I, as a hunter, can get on green sections that are private land and get to the corner of one of those, can I cross at that corner onto the public land at the other corner? Well, if I could just have Scotty beam me up and place me over there, as in space age things, maybe I could do it. Well, that's not going to happen. I can't fly, so I can't do it. But some hunters, I believe from Nebraska, said, well, we know how to do it. And there's the picture. The ranch had put up no trespassing signs. They were quite clear. Elk Mountain Ranch said, no, you can't cross over this little corner, which is infinitesimally small. But the hunter said, well, yes, we can. We're going to build a ladder. We're going to take it out there. We're going to straddle a fence. We're going to climb the ladder, go down the other side, and we haven't trespassed. The ranch said, yes, you have, called the sheriff. The sheriff came, arrested them. It ended up in a big lawsuit, and the hunters won. Now, the point of this is these are just destined to create all kinds of conflict across places like Wyoming, Montana, Idaho, and all the western states where you have these checkerboards. So one policy to think about, short of privatizing all these checkerboards, is there a way to make some land trades? And what can happen with land trades is really, there are two things. One is you reduce some of these conflicts, because now it's not the rancher versus the hunter. If we just took half that map and made it all public and the other half and made it all Elk Mountain, then at least you wouldn't have the conflict of these hunters. But here's a better one. Some of you may know of. You may have been there, and you may even own property at a place called the Yellowstone Club. And the Yellowstone Club is next to another ski area, Big Sky. Yellowstone Club was started by a guy named Tim Blixith, and Tim Blixith owned a lumber company. He owned some of those checkerboards, and the Forest Service had the other checkerboards. The checkerboards were almost impossible to do anything with. People who wanted to preserve land for endangered species said, well, we can't do anything. These are 1 square mile sections. We can't do anything with 640 acres to save the Canada lynx, for example. So what could you do? How could you do it? Well, Blixith went to the Forest Service, managed to engage in a trade that allowed Yellowstone Club to be created. He created it. And it's got some pretty nice homes in it. It's private skiing. You can only get on there if you own a house, or in my case, my son works for the ski patrol and he can get me on. So I get to ski there once in a while. So they manage it that way. But just across the line where these checkerboards used to be is now big blocks of Forest Service, and they can manage it for timber rotation, they can manage it for wildlife, they can manage it for watershed, all kinds of things that they couldn't do before. And it was a land trade. I put the small letters there if you want. If you can't read it, I can give you the numbers. He had to put some money into it, but they made the trade. So my point is, there are ways short of selling it or privatizing it. But there are some other things. We can change the incentives that people have to manage these lands, either the private landowner or the public landowners. We can remove some of the regulations, and we can find ways to market more of the services. Those are parts of what I think of as possible policy changes that could make a difference. But I'm not going to talk any longer about those. I'm going to turn it over to two people who do have something to say about, I think, almost all three of those. And did we decide who starts? You? All right. So we'll spend the next few minutes talking about actual data on management issues and incentive changes and other ways that we might make the system work better, short of privatizing the public lands.
All right, thank you, Terry. All right, hi everybody. My name's Jordan. I'm a grad student right here in political science. I am defending part of this project in 3 weeks, which is why I'm a bit sleep deprived. But I'm an incoming Hoover Fellow in the fall. My research is about the history and impact of forest management policy over the last 120 years. There's kind of two major categories of management policy. There's the category of how we put fires out, and then the category of how we cut trees down and manage forests actively. I do so using the state of Oregon. I'm going to show you data from my project in Oregon, and I use Oregon for a couple of reasons. It's sort of a microcosm for a lot of these issues as they played out on the national scale. Oregon's about half federal timberland, one of the largest softwood exporters, like softwood producers in the country. So timber's a big cultural part of this, and a lot of the lawsuits that played out between foresters in Oregon and environmental activists in Oregon ended up extrapolating and are now national policies. So Oregon's kind of a sandbox for a lot of this. And the main argument I'm going to be making today is that if we wanted to meaningfully balance the budget of the Forest Service, costs are exploding way faster than revenues are diminishing. And so to balance any budgets here, we need to focus on the cost side, not the revenue side. I'm not going to go too deep into the forestry science here, but just echoing on something that Judd said earlier. Forests naturally just need to burn. Western pine forests have adapted all sorts of ways of using fire. But in essence, when fires burn often, they clear fuels from the forest floor. And so when they burn often, they stay small. When fires don't burn, fuels accumulate, and then a small fire becomes a big fire very quickly. Those are the ones that we're seeing today. All right, so this data is coming from my dissertation. What I've done is I've taken the state of Oregon, and I've broken up the whole state into 7-acre grid cells. And every 7-acre grid cell, it's about 700 feet across in a square. And you can study 120 years of history, both in terms of exactly where the government has cut trees down, how we've cut it down, whether it was a shelter wood cut or a clear cut or a single tree selection, commercial thinning. We have data on all of this. And we also know where the fires have been. And so for 120 years, for every grid cell, I can track the history of management and the history of fire. And then I can interact all sorts of other things, like shifts in climate, how bad drought was that year, topography, all sorts of things. And so what I can do is I can kind of show the impact of management in the past on fire outcomes in the present today. And so just to start with some data here. This is the state of Oregon. I'm showing you 1,000-acre wildfires. So every fire listed here has gotten pretty big. And I'm showing you 120 years of data. And so we kind of have three main eras here. We've got this early period before World War II, where fires in expectation wouldn't happen every year. But when they did happen, they would get pretty large. And it wasn't unheard of to have a year in which you had a really big fire. 1910 was the big blow up, where essentially it was like Western Montana, Idaho. This led to a lot of fire suppression policy. But then the mid-century, we really just don't have very many fires because we're busy suppressing them everywhere we can. We had the will to suppress fires before the 30s, but we just didn't have the technology. We had no helicopters, we had no chainsaws, so you had people manually with Pulaskis in the woods just digging holes. And so it was a really inefficient way of fighting fires. Our technology gets better though, and after World War II, we start to be able to put out 98% of wildfires. And that's to say that 98% of wildfires are put out before they get to 30 acres, which means that only 2% of the natural fuel cycling that would have happened is happening. And so we've got sort of a pressure cooker on our hands, where every time we put a fire out, that's fuel that would have been removed from the system that's now going to be there for next year. And these things keep growing back. And then by the present day, just to make sure that we all sort of agree that what we see today is not normal. In expectation, you have large fires every single year in Oregon. A lot of them are on national forest land, that's the color here, but you see in 2020, a lot of private land burned as well as some tribal land, some state land. So this isn't only a national forest problem. And then similarly, there's the land burned in wildfire, and then there's the money we spent fighting wildfires. And so this is comparing the Forest Service and then other Department of Interior agencies like BLM. And this is since '85. We see that the trend in how much money we're spending every year to fight these big fires just keeps climbing and keeps climbing. And so in the last 5 years, the average amount of money we spend fighting fires would have been unheard of in the period of '85 to '90. A critical threshold here was that in 2013, the Forest Service started spending half of its budget allocation just fighting fires. And it's never dipped back below that level. And so every single year since 2013, more than half the money the Forest Service is getting, they're just spending it fighting fires. So in terms of what it would mean to balance the budget, they could just stop fighting fires. But that's not really in public's interest very much. And so then on the other side of the equation here, we can look at what the Forest Service has been doing in terms of managing fuel loads on national forests. And so before World War II, Forest Service really isn't cutting a lot of timber from national forests. Most of this is happening on private land. World War II ends, all of the veterans come home, we pass the GI Bill, we have this congressional goal of cheap loans for veterans. Cheap loans mean cheap houses mean cheap lumber. And so there is a congressional mandated goal to increase output on national forests every single year. And so it's not like the foresters were the ones completely behind it. This is Congress pushing the foresters to increase technologies, increase extraction every year, get more harvest than you did the last year. And most of this was done with clear cuts. We could argue all day about whether clear cuts are good for the environment, bad for the environment. But one impact they have is that they affect fire risk at the system level, at the landscape scale, because you're talking about acres and acres of fuel breaks now. And the clear cuts here are in red. And so after World War II, we're ramping up clear cuts. Simultaneously, we have a lot of pushback from the public as they see these scars. Always interesting to note, one of the very first citizen groups to sue the Forest Service over clear cuts were turkey farmers in West Virginia. So at this point, this wasn't a right versus left thing. This was seen as private outdoorsmen trying to keep the prying hands of the government off of what they saw as their shared collective lands. And so what happens is by the 90s, the Forest Service just stops clear cutting. And when the Forest Service stops clear cutting, they kind of stop doing most of their active management for a good 10, 15 years. And in recent years, they've started to do more thinning, which is not clearing an entire forest. It's coming through and spacing trees further apart, bringing the canopies up, getting rid of ground fuels. But the kicker is that in the present, so comparing the clear cuts of the past in red and the thinning today in green, the clear cuts generated money for the Forest Service, which it could then use on all sorts of other things, like buying fire trucks and schools and roads and hiring new mitigation workers. And in the present era, the green treatments cost money. They don't generate money. And we'll come back to this too, but the scale that we've treated here is paltry. Like it is maybe 5% of the hazardous lands that we have eligible to be treated. And so these two things kind of add together. So we have been putting out fires for 120 years. We've become very, very, very good at putting out fires, and so usually they don't get big. And on the other hand of the ledger, we cut down a lot of trees for a long time and then stopped cutting down everything. So the trees that we did cut down after World War II up until peak harvest was in 1986, those trees have all grown back. And we haven't gotten rid of any of them. And we've kept continually suppressing fires, so those forests have all continually gotten thicker, which means that the forests we have today just don't look like they used to. An inventory was done in Fremont Wainema National Forest in Oregon. This is mostly ponderosa pine, but what they found was that there were, on average, 3 times as many trees as there were in 1914, and the nature of those trees changed completely. And so instead of having variation in coverage, and you had some stands of old trees, and then some meadows and natural fuel breaks, you have a sea of uninterrupted green. And all of these trees have now, we've pretty much gotten rid of most of the old trees, and now these are younger trees, smaller trees that are less fire resistant. And so we have forests that are just, for lack of a better term, ready to burn. We have a way back from this. We have 2 tools. One is cutting trees down, so the fuels that would have burned themselves, we remove from the system. And then the other is introducing our own fire, which mimics what a natural fire would have done. And we have a lot of evidence showing that mitigation work decreases costs in future years for fighting fires. My own research in Oregon, what I've done is in the last 20 years, every time the Forest Service has done a fuels project, I've taken note of what kind of project that was, and I've looked at which grid cells end up burning later on in the panel. And the parcels of forest that the Forest Service has been able to treat for fuels in the last 10 years burn much less often than the places that they are not able to treat. And so we see this working on the ground. The issue is a matter of scale. Right now, we're not doing this at the landscape level. We're doing this on the parcel level. And so it's difficult for these impacts to actually ramify into the system. But Western Australia has a bit longer evidence to show us where they've been involved in controlled burns for a long time. And there's an inverse relationship between the acreage controlled burned in 1 year and the amount of money spent following year fighting fires. And unfortunately, Australia is facing some of the similar problems that we are, where the windows to have these controlled burns happen are getting shorter. And so we're actually seeing the trend reverse itself in Australia, where they're starting to burn less, and in conjunction, they're starting to spend more on fires. And so this isn't, it's interesting to look at the policy outside of the US context, where you could kind of see a counterfactual for where we could be, but then you also see them experiencing the same political issues that we are. But in terms of trying to balance the budget, getting a hold of costs is going to be far more efficient than increasing revenues, and getting control of costs can actually introduce new ways of creating revenue. Most of the hazardous fuel that's in the forest isn't timber. It's not large commercially saleable trees. We're talking about bushes, underbrush, limbs. But that's not to say that there's no market value from this. And the Forest Service has the vehicle already in place for them to trade goods and services with private forestry. And so what we could move into is a system in which we allow the Forest Service to clear cut more land, and these will become fuel breaks between forests, and the revenue from that clear cut will fund the mitigation work in the surrounding forest that we're not going to clear cut. There's ways to make this at least revenue neutral. And I think that Seren's going to talk a bit more about that. So thank you. Look forward to some questions, and I'll leave it there.
Seren, I sat down before I introduced either of them. I'm sorry about that, but you did it. You got yours done. So, now we have Seren Pendleton-Knoll with Blue Forest, and Blue Forest is an organization that I would say is finding alternatives short of privatization, but using private ideas to change management techniques, if I got that right.
Thank you, Terry. I was going to say, if you hadn't done my bio, I could just make up whatever I wanted and sound very impressive. So yeah, my name is Seren. I'm with Blue Forest. We've solved all the problems we've talked about today. But no, really, we're a conservation finance nonprofit. We're looking at really how do you monitor, monetize the ecosystem benefits of restoration. Specifically, we're focusing on the Western United States, forest restoration, and the prevention and reduction of catastrophic wildfire. And so I'm going to kind of reverse time for about a decade ago when Blue Forest was started and was seated at a university that would not be named across the bay, at an MBA program over there. So it was in 2013, the Rim fire was happening as they were starting their master's program and really devastating air quality, quality of life. And being MBA students, they thought there has got to be a better way to finance catastrophic wildfire risk reduction through modeling, through a financial mechanism. And as they started to dig a little bit more in understanding what is causing the catastrophic wildfires that we're seeing on the West Coast, there was really kind of three findings that were emerging as they explored this. The first one that we've been talking about is really this funding and scale gap. So right now in the United States, we're currently treating about 2 to 3 million acres a year and getting it back to the landscapes that we were talking about that are healthy, that are resilient after a century of fire suppression and moving indigenous peoples off the lands and removal of active management that indigenous peoples have been practicing since time immemorial on this landscape. So we have a backlog of immense fuels on landscapes. And we're currently, as I said, treating about 2 to 3 million. We need to actually be treating an additional 50 million acres over the next 10 years on top of those 2 to 3 each year. And tied with that was really the funding for this. So even though we've received through IRA and IIGA, if those funds remained, around $5 billion for forest restoration and management, we need about $50 to $100 billion to do the restoration that we need on the West Coast to get our forests to where they are. So that was the one, really the pace, the scale, the funding was one challenge. The second challenge is really the implementation partners and the crews on the ground doing the work. So even though that they have received contracts with the federal government, they do not get paid until their work is complete. What this means for small, locally based contractors, that is massive amounts of cash flow challenges. They need to float that capital. They're not able to scale. They're not able to hire local crews. You need to have big contractors that don't necessarily understand the local landscape doing the work. And that is obviously impacting their ability to scale to bigger projects, that cash flow constraint. So there's a reimbursability and cash flow problem. And the third one, and I'm going to click, let's see if I do this right, is really, we know there's a suite of ecosystem benefits in restoring our landscapes, and no one was monetizing this. So we're able to have the science behind the benefits of ecosystem that's coming off. We've talked a lot about these today. Biodiversity, water security, the quality, the quantity that's coming off of landscapes when you do active restoration in an area and preserve that land. But no one was really doing that economic case of that. And what was happening is in landscapes that were getting restored by the federal government, there was a lot of free riders. Companies you think of such as utilities or counties that were benefiting from that landscape restoration through increased water yield, et cetera, were not paying into that, right? So they were essentially receiving some of those benefits for free. So there's got to be a financial solution here, which led us to creating the Forest Resilience Bond. So the Forest Resilience Bond was created in partnership with the World Resource Institute as well as the National Forest Foundation. And it really took the idea of once projects were already permitted and planned by the Forest Service, how do we increase the pace and scale of that? And how do we bring additional dollars to a landscape? So if I had a little laser, I would point. So I'll just gesticulate. So if we start overall all the way to the side, we have our investors. So we pool together PRI investors. So this is not market rate at this point. This is PRI investors from foundations that really are looking for a return, but are looking for a return in a more impact-oriented way. So they are pooling the funds so that we are able to, through the Forest Resilience Bond, pay the implementation partners within 7 days of the work being completed. They are not waiting for 2, 3, 4, 12 months to get reimbursement. They do the restoration activities, and then there's a bunch of benefits that happen. At Blue Forest, we have an in-house science team that is calculating those benefits that are occurring on the landscape. We partner with agencies like the World Resource Institute to calculate the economic benefits of that. And then we go to beneficiaries, so we go to utilities, we go to counties, we go to anyone local to that landscape, we go to corporates as well, and show them the economic benefit of, hey, if you pay into this, and we do this restoration, you are going to get X amount more water yield each year in your watershed. You are going to have X amount of avoided wildfire emissions. You can calculate it in this way, and this is the benefit. So then they pay what is the equivalent of the benefits that they are receiving as an agency into the bond, which allows us to repay the investors and give the implementation partners a zero-cost loan, 0% interest. When they typically go to banks, they're getting about a 10 to 15% interest rate, which the federal government is covering the interest rate costs. So we are really seeing that through the FRB, we were able to do a few things with that. So our first project was the Yuba 1 Forest Resilience Bond. It was 15,000 acres. It was a pilot project in the Tahoe region. It was $4 million. Because we had such success with that, we were able to scale up to the Yuba 2 Forest Resilience Bond, which was a 50,000 acre project, $25 million. But the really exciting thing is that that project, the Yuba 1 Forest Resilience Bond, that was slated to take 10 to 12 years from the Forest Service side to complete. We were able to do it in 5, which really freed us up to do the second project. And then that catalyzed, which is a really big thing at Blue Forest. We do everything through our science, through our finance, and then through collaboration. So that collaboration piece is we catalyzed the North Yuba Forest Partnership, which is a group of players all in the area that are benefiting from forest restoration. And now they've committed to restoring 275,000 acres. So we went from a 15,000 acre project now protection to over 250,000 acres. So right now, we have 6 FRB projects that are live across California, Oregon, Washington. We have 3 more in financial due diligence right now. And you can see at least a dozen more in development across the western United States. And these are exploring not just public lands. Most of our projects have been public lands to date, but we're looking at private lands as well. We have our first private lands one in the Southern Oregon, Northern California region. We have some projects in financial due diligence on tribal lands, and we're also looking at state lands as well. So it's a really kind of nimble one that is custom made for each ecosystem that we're looking at. And what's really been exciting with the pressure cooker of this federal uncertainty right now is we've been really able to unearth the benefits that we're providing for the federal government. So to date, Blue Forest has received about $5 million in order to set up these conservation finance agreements. But we have brought over $40 million of benefit of additional funding coming to landscapes. So that is an 8-fold return to the federal government, which we think is a really good bang for their buck. And we're bringing more dollars to landscapes because of this ability to bring in beneficiaries. We're also doing that increased pace and scale. As I mentioned, we were able to do things in 5 years instead of 12 years, which is really leading to much larger scale projects. And with anything with bigger scale is lower cost. So really that, what was talked about a lot today in terms of the transaction costs, we're able to reduce that transaction cost substantially when you're able to scale. And right now, forest restoration is a massively high transaction cost. It's about $1,000 to $4,000 on average per acre treatment. Massive cost. If we're able to do this at scale, that reduces that substantially. And then the big other thing that we're unlocking for the federal government is that the reduce of an administrative burden. Because they don't have to reimburse as soon as the work's completed, we're doing that. They can do this on a quarterly basis. It allows them to have some breadth and not needing to staff so many staff on reimbursing grants, right? So what's been really exciting about this on the Blue Forest side is because we've had success on the Forest Resilience Bonds, we're innovating them in a number of other ways. We have the Forest Resilience Bond Catalyst facility now, which is aggregating all of these pilot projects and is revolving PRI investments from a $15 million fund into $50 million of projects. So as it gets paid back, we're able to launch another project. And we're able to do this on a pilot scale and take lessons learned. So what worked in the Yuba region is not going to work in Oregon, is not going to work in Southern California, is not going to work on tribal lands. So if you start with small pilot projects, bring in new types of beneficiaries, you can learn from them, then scale with those same players in that same area and have lessons learned that are very bespoke to each ecosystem in each region and each partnership. And then we also, as has kind of been determined, there really needs to be some market rate solutions to this as well, and there's a ton of biomass that's being generated on landscapes. So with all this restoration that's happening right now, and with timber milling facilities closing in California, those were all generated for big diameter trees. Most people don't want to be doing massive clear cutting projects anymore, but we have these small diameter trees now. and that are literally in massive piles that are just being burned on landscapes. There's got to be a better way to utilize this biomass for revenue generation, for carbon outcomes, for all sorts of public health. You don't want those burned in the air. And so we have the California Wildfire Innovation Fund now, which was invested in by the CSAA, the Homeowners Insurance in California, and the California iBank, which is a $50 million fund that's investing in biomass utilization and infrastructure building up to really revitalize the restoration economy in California. We've invested in milling facilities in California that are processing small diameter trees as well as post-fire. So what are the innovations that we can have in this space to really build that out? So with that, I think we'll take it back to you guys and we can turn off my slides.
I do want to open it to questions from you, but I have one question for each of for Seren and for sorry about that. But before I do that, we have sitting in the front row here, a couple of rows back, I mentioned at the very outset that we've started a new program here at Hoover called the Enviropreneur Program, Environmental Entrepreneurs. And actually some of what you've talked about fits what they're doing. When we started the discussion, Nick and I started the discussion with them yesterday, we talked about the intellectual foundations that might be available at Hoover, at Stanford, at the Door School, and the kind of bookends on either side of me here kind of give a better feel to me for what I was saying, kind of the intellectual foundations, looking at data and studying how the work is done and how profitable or not profitable it is, what management techniques there are and how they vary in terms of results as well as costs. And on the other side, someone who's taking an innovative contracting approach, if I can use that to describe the resilience bonds. I taught a course here in the business school for a while on environmental entrepreneurship, and I remember I had another Oregon person from what was then the Oregon Water Trust that was using various financial tools to get more water in streams, and one of the people was talking about using option contracts, and I thought some of the colleagues at the business school, if walking by, would have thought, gee, I wonder what this business course is. And yet here were people who were environmentalists talking about how to use the kinds of tools that you might pick up if you were at the GSB. And I think the same of thinking about resilience bonds, just the sort of financial mechanism that's there that can be used. But I said I have a couple of questions. Every year, John Taylor, one of my colleagues here at Hoover, who does macroeconomics and is famous for something called the Taylor Rule about how to manage the money supply. And at the conference last year, these speakers were getting up and they kept saying, we need to do this, we need to do that, we need to follow the Taylor Rule, we don't need to follow the Taylor Rule, we should increase the money supply more, we should reduce interest rates. And I finally, in the Q&A, got up. I don't know much about micro or macroeconomics, but I knew enough to say, who's the we, and what does it mean to say we should? How is that going to happen? What needs to change at the Fed in this case? We should manage differently. What stands in the way of what seems obvious to me, to you, to Seren, I think, and to many people here probably? What stands in the way of that? Is it just I like the green canopy that I can see as I drive along and look up the mountainside? Is it I have some sort of mystic view of forests or just living things and we need to leave them alone? Who is the we? Where does it come from?
Yeah, there's certainly a we in terms of the political demand for policies that's shifted over time. In the post-war period, sort of this collective belief in the expansion of industry and the science of managing industrial forests And that kind of got replaced by a public belief starting in the 60s with Silent Spring, culminating into the 70s and 80s, where people started to see the science as being protecting biodiversity instead of expanding production. So we're seeing kind of shifting beliefs from the public, but I think in terms of the biggest hindrance for being able to do the work we know needs to get done is that we've, by design, created impediments in the system. We've created veto points, which we've given people oversight over the federal government's processes by design. And you can say it's a good thing, you can say it's a bad thing, they're in there. To remove them would be to remove oversight that in the past we decided needed to be there. But it's the veto points that we've given to people because there's not really any ability to. The Forest Service, over the last 20 years, they've looked at NEPA complaints. And so people that have filed suits trying to stop the Forest Service from doing projects. And what you discover is that 80% of the projects the Forest Service has done in the last 20 years are called categorical exclusions. And so it means that they're small enough in scope that they didn't require their own environmental study. But they're small by definition, and that's the only way that they can get around the legal obstructions. And so they've kind of settled into this method of they do small projects that aren't going to get fought, which don't aggregate up to system-level scale, but that's kind of showing where the system is today.
Jordan, do you think that I think you said this in the phone conversation, is a lot of this back to Smokey the Bear and the kind of woodsy owl nurturing that we've put kids through for sure and generations through?
There's absolutely been an effect of that. Smokey the Bear, they've done studies. Smokey the Bear is one of the most publicly recognized figures in American pop media, maybe behind only Mickey Mouse. And if you find anybody off the street, they can tell you, like, you just show them a picture of Smokey the Bear, and they say, only you can prevent forest fires, wildfires now. And so we have a very deeply instilled public belief that fire is bad. And as long as that belief holds, you'll have the Forest Service fielding hundreds of complaints every time they have a prescribed burn, or thinking that every single active forest management is just a cover for timber extraction, and removing any trees from the forest is just letting the industry win. I think that there's a lot of education we can do to the public, but it's not like we have to lecture the public. These things, policy follows public demand, as opposed to the other way around.
I heard you say forest fires and then quickly changed it to wildfires.
That was an official
was that
change.
Again, kind of a part of what's created this momentum? If I said, oh, there's a forest fire, you'd think, oh, there's some trees burning. But if I say wildfire, you're like, oh, my gosh, it seems just the words seem to have an impact, I think.
There may have been an aspect of that. I think it was more just semantic clarity, because fires happen in chaparral. It's not technically a deep forest. Fires happen across like sagebrush. Australia had brush fires. So it's a bit of it's just less precise. It's not that crucial.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I think I'll push against the Smokey the Bear being our kind of like, that's the problem. From the perspective of, first of all, the majority of catastrophic wildfires still start by human ignition at the first place. Like roadside ignitions in southern LA and chaparral regions, most of the fires are started by roadside ignitions that happen from overheated vehicles that go on the side of the road. In forested regions, it's still campfires that don't get put out, cigarettes that don't get thrown out the window, right? Like still the majority. However, right, if our forests were actively managed, they wouldn't have resulted in catastrophic wildfire. We would have had a kind of a natural course of fire that goes through those landscape. We wouldn't, it kind of causes that catastrophic event that we wouldn't have had right now. I think from my perspective, what I'm seeing is like the biggest barrier right now is twofold. One is the drastic kind of lack of ability to change to the volatility in the weather events that we're seeing. So that the droughts followed by the rain events followed by the drought events followed by high wind events, like that is just the perfect storm for these massive wildfire events that are going to be increasing, paired with the lack of management that happened, paired with the removal of traditional ecological knowledge and the indigenous ways of preserving the landscapes. We're just going to be fighting fires instead of being able to do management in advance. With already such a deficit being put towards active management of lands, where we only have, again, $5 billion when we need $100 billion to do this, those resources are going to be put towards firefighting and not being going towards active management, which is going to lead to more overstock. Like, it's just going to be the snowballing effect, which I think is going to be the hardest thing, is no one's going to say, take the money from the firefighters, let's do active management instead. There's just really going to have to be more innovative funding and financing coming to the land in order to do this at scale.
Can I add one more thing in terms of the hindrances?
Sure.
Yeah. As the policy developed, and we were coming up with all sorts of new ways of protecting aspects, whether it's protecting people's right to recreation, protecting watersheds, protecting biodiversity, each of these things was litigated in a very narrow sense. And so we were very good at protecting individual features of a system. We can protect the rights of spotted owls. We can protect soil in a certain area. We're very bad at managing system-level outcomes because we're zoomed in on each individual feature. An example of this that was really striking to me, there was an LA Times article in 2019 about the LA Department of Water and Power going through and trying to do a fuels mitigation project in Topanga State Forest, which is exactly where the Palisades fire started. And the goal was to go through, replace old wooden power lines that were built in the 30s or the 50s, replace them with metal power lines, make the road wider, make it longer, do some fuel work. And halfway through the project, a local homeowner went through and realized that they had accidentally or purposefully cut down a couple hundred endangered bush. It was called the Bronton's milk vetch. And the judge looked into this and actually put an injunction on the project and said, whoa, 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 this is an endangered species. Explain to us why you're killing hundreds of this thing. You can't keep going until you can explain this. And so the fuels mitigation was halted. And the irony is that 5 years later, I think that there far more Bronton's milk vetch were killed in the Palisades fire than ever would have been killed with fuels mitigation projects by LA Department of Water and Power. So by trying to protect the features, we're failing the system.
Great conclusion. If I can come back, Seren, to the scale that Jordan's talking about and the bonds you're talking about. Here we sit, Silicon Valley. Do you see a time when doing these resilience bonds will be kind of just, oh, that's how you do business? Do you think it's really improving? The market for that, is it improving? And do you see people you work with in the environmental movement, if that's an appropriate term, thinking more like you think about using financial mechanisms of that sort? Markets versus mandates.
Well, I think there's a growing realization you need a blended approach, right? There isn't a silver bullet here. It's not just going to be Silicon Valley coming to save the day. It's not just going to be foundations opening their coffers and giving away their billions of dollars. It's not going to be the government mandating everything, right? We need an approach that recognizes the benefits and the costs of each of those players and where they're going to play a role. I think where it has been really exciting to see the innovation and understanding is people are really understanding now, right? Where we heard neighbor complaints before of like, I don't want the bad air during prescribed burning, people are now saying, okay, well, maybe this is better than my entire area completely going away. And so for better for worse, some of the bigger fires have negated some of that local community concern. But I would see, I think foundations are getting more interested in program-related investments where they're wanting a return but not needing a market rate return, paired with how are we scaling innovation that allows that transactional cost to go down, right? It is very expensive to have an individual chainsaw person in the forest cutting down invasives. Massively expensive and time consuming. If we're able to invest in technologies that can do this at scale through AI, through remote controlling sensing, through technologies such as BurnBot, which I didn't even talk about, but Google them, very cool. We're able to do this much cheaper, much larger, at greater capacity. So I think the innovation and investment into those technologies is really exciting. And pairing that with then foundational investment to help subsidize some of the financing of the on-the-ground work.
I think we could take one or two questions if we have them.
One of the important consequences of increasing mega fires is air pollution. and there are people on this campus who've done work that suggests the economic damages of that air pollution to people's health is on the order of, if not larger than, the suppression expenses that Jordan was talking about, or the property damage that I've studied in my work. And so, and unlike the industrial air pollution that Jonathan was talking about earlier, that we've been so successful in reducing, this pollution goes very far. This crosses the continent. And so, is there a market-based way to harness the potential benefit to those lungs that can then pay for these local projects, or should we think about this as something that should be handled in a different way, or should we think about this as the local benefits are going to be big enough that they're going to reduce fire, and then the lungs on the other side of the continent just benefit in an ancillary way from these reductions that are paid for locally? I think keeping the first order importance of the air quality benefits in mind seems important.
So, yeah, at Blue Forest, we did a co-commissioned study, we colloquially call it the smoke study, that was essentially the same findings, massive amounts of healthcare costs with smoke. And the conclusion was very similar of, well, golly, the Forest Resilience Fund is finding beneficiaries at a local scale. That's not how smoke works. Like, Bay Area residents get impacted by fire that's happening up in Northern California. Like, how are we going to be financing this through a bond? So that is an area that our science team is working on figuring out. How do we then work with health insurance agencies like Kaiser, like Sutter, who are at a broader scale to invest in this? How do we work with the states to invest in this? So that's more of the thinking of how do we do a more systemic investment. That's not looking globally, that's still a little more locally, but there is a recognition we can't do this on the hyper-local. This has to be more at a state or insurance level in order to do that. Do you have other color, Jordan?
No, I mean, I was just going to point out like a weird tension of the system is like agreed air quality is a huge problem and causes all these very acute health problems. And so counties track their emissions, states track their emissions. And one issue right now with controlled burning is that the emissions released in controlled burns are counted in the official emission standards for that county. And so the local owners don't want, or the local stakeholders don't want there to be controlled burns because it's going to be hurting their outcomes. And it's like, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
One brief question, and take it away, Daniel.
I mean, I know there's, I'm familiar with the resiliency bonds and Blue Forest, and I just think, and to what Terry had said earlier about what the Congress wants to do, it's the Congress just, or the House of Natural Resources Committee they kept the 11,000 acres that they want to sell in Utah and Nevada in the bill. So that has to be fought out. If it makes it in the Senate, I'm not sure. But these movements are always around to sell public lands. And so, but if we go back to why they're public lands in the first place, that includes the tribes, right? All the whole of the United States was Indian country, every acre, and a lot of natives still consider it. These are tribal lands, even though they're technically government lands. And so I think that tribes have to be integral in the management. When Jordan posted his timeline at the beginning, there's no mention of, at the beginning of the century, there was still a movement to remove natives from these landscapes. They were still on federal lands, national parks, and they removed them out by the 1920s. And so one of the reasons why there wasn't a lot of fires in those eras is because there were natives there taking care of the land. And I know the other speaker talked about that, about tribal ecological TEK. But that kind of ruffles me a little bit, the TEK, because it kind of makes us as though we're just caretakers and we're just gardeners of what was once our land. And so really there has to be co-management strategies between the tribes that are interested in the federal government and these agencies to co-manage the lands, even though it's not ownership, but it really would go towards healing those wounds of watching our lands, our ancestral territories be overrun by fire and by development, and we really can't do anything about it. 90% of my ancestral territory is Shasta National Forest, Lassen National Forest, Modoc National Forest, National Park Service, BLM. They just made a new monument or whatever in the Medicine Lake Highlands, which is my ancestral territory in California, and it's like, these protections are important, and all the work that these guys are doing and propose are really important. But it kind of is bittersweet, because that just means when they make it into a national monument, we have even less access to the land as tribal people. So I just wanted to say that. I mean, I really applaud these people with the work that they're doing, and hopefully they continue with the research and with the resiliency bond. But as a tribal person, it really is. I'm conflicted with the whole process. But I just wanted to say that.
Well, let me use that as a jumping off point for closing the day. Well, the reception is outside to close the day, and I can see tables, so I don't want to hold everybody till 5 o'clock. But we did want to get some ideas about what might be some implications for policy changes. Daniel has just said some co-management with tribes. That's certainly one. I suggested more trades and submission of profit and loss statements. Let me ask the two panelists who are here, and then I'm going to ask Nick to come back up, because I'm sure he's got lots of ideas. So,
local autonomy, whether it's federal, whether it's public or private management, just having decisions made locally and having local stakeholders be the ones involved. The most gains we've seen over the last couple decades in terms of places that have been actually able to make forests more resilient again are places where co-ops have formed, in which you have people with with tension between them. You have forest owners and soil hydrologists and county officials. Like, you have a diverse room of people that all agree on the first principle that our forests have not been managed well, and something needs to change going forward. Once you get people in a room that agree on that, all of a sudden you start making strides in what you can do together, and it reframes any litigation that happens, where normally a judge sees that the Forest Service is getting sued by the Sierra Club, and they're like, well, timber extraction, protecting the environment, I don't really know here, and so they listen to the facts of the case and might side with the Sierra Club. But in this situation with the collaborative group, it's the Sierra Club suing the local community, and the local community includes environmental scientists and plenty of people who are not industry people, and the judge is like, well, I'm not gonna, this is the community, and so it's making the litigation smoother by allowing for the compromises to happen before the project, and there's just less tension. It's people walking together, not people tug-of-warring with each other.
Yeah. Well, that sort of takes us back to Gary's opening with problems being local and getting more focus at the local level, where information is often pretty well in hand, even without universities like Stanford. Seren, do you have a thought on policy recommendations?
Yeah, a couple recommendations, and thank you for the last comment too. That was a whole other chunk of my talk we didn't even get to. The recommendation of co-management and land back programs. Well,
if you want to stand between people and the reception,
I
try
need
it.
a nap, so we're good. I would say, a few recommendations. One is the Intertribal Timber Coalition's put together some great recommendations for the Appropriations Committee. So a few of those I want to call out. One is there's massive disparity in funding between Indian forests and national forest run by the federal government. So really bridging that disparity and making sure there's adequate funding, funding at the BIA level as well. And then really what has been brought up a few times is to report on that funding per acre, but also report on that funding per acre on given from the government to Indian forests versus U.S. Forest Service versus Park Service. So we're really able to see that discrepancy. And then to compare the restoration costs against wildfire and rehabilitation post-fire. So I know we talked about how we have a deficit. We're spending so much, we're not generating revenue, but we're really not able to compare apples to apples if we're not looking at what would have happened had a catastrophic wildfire come through and what the economic cost would have been. So comparing those restoration costs against wildfire. And then two others was through the report of wildland fire mitigation and the Management Commission report. Two that we're really promoting is number 19, which is that Congress invests in wood processing facilities and wood utilization sector to really help with this innovation on the wood utilization and the biomass coming off of landscapes. And then, of course, 113, which is the foster of the use of conservation finance agreements on landscapes, because that's what we do. So that's something that we're really pushing forward on the policy side.
In my previous life, I was the director of an organization in Montana called the Property and Environment Research Center, and we did a very careful study looking at the Salish Kootenai tribe's management of their forests, and I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head other than for every dollar spent on the nearby national forests, there was, I've forgotten, 5 cents in revenue. Not a good rate of return. And then on the Salish Kootenai, as I recall, it was something like $1.50 or something like that per dollar spent. Plus, they had better wildlife habitat, they had better watershed, and the list went on.
Now, the national average is $3 in revenue on tribal forests.
Oh, was that right? Well, guess, Daniel, you can invest in the tribal forests, and we get to have the national forest. You want to trade? So with that, let me ask for other suggestions. Nick, in particular, take the stage. You can have my chair. Jordan, you can stay here or give your chair to him. Thanks to Jordan and Seren, please.